All right. Okay. So, yeah, thanks all for joining. So today it's great to have Shikhara for our supergroup presentations. Those who are for the first time joining this Drosophila supergroup meetings, this is basically rather informal gathering, online gathering, where we mostly discuss something related to ecology and evolution. Generally, the talks are given by the students, and the format is like you can potentially ask any particular clarificatory question, particularly for this talk. Any clarificatory questions you can ask now or during the talk, and those which are more discussion oriented, that can be asked towards the end of the talk. You can always post questions on the chat such that we can go back to it, I mean, as Shikhara finds it, right? So Shikhara is he just completed his BSMS from ISER Pune, right? And he completed his he did his final MS dissertation work at IISc with Professor Vishesha Guttal, right? And this work is mostly related to that, right? So let us hear from Shikhara. And yeah, so feel free to raise hands or put questions on chat. We'll take up as we go. Okay, over to you, Shikhara.
Thank you, Sudipto. I will say, if there are clarificatory questions that you put in the chat, I can't read it while presenting, so it would be great if somebody could just keep an eye on that. But yeah, discussion type questions I'll get back to at the end of the talk. So to start with, I will speak to you today about describing evolution in finite fluctuating populations from first principles. This is work I did as part of my MS thesis at IISc. To begin with, let me talk about what exactly I mean by evolution. So microevolution is typically described as a change in frequency of an allele, genotype, phenotype, some sort of trait variance. So for example, let's say we have a population of birds which come in two types, red and blue. Here we can calculate the proportion of blue birds in this population, here 3/8. And we will say that evolution has occurred if this number changes. This number can change with the total population size remaining constant if one or more red birds are replaced by blue birds, for example, in which case we will say evolution has occurred. It can also happen through a change in total population size if the two types grow asymmetrically. Here, blue birds are growing faster than red birds. But changes in total population size which maintain frequency of each type is not evolution for our purposes. This will be important later. So to describe evolution mathematically, we have a very, very general framework called the price equation. Some of you may be familiar with it. The price equation says broadly that the change in mean phenotype in a population can be decomposed into an effect of natural selection plus a mutation or transmission bias. In equations, if we have a phenotype Z that can be assigned a numerical value, like let's say beak length or height, for example, and a fitness W associated with each phenotype, in continuous time, the price equation looks like this. It says that the mean fitness changes according to a covariance with fitness, meaning if you covary positively with fitness, you increase in the population, plus a mutation term which I have not written out explicitly. The price equation, it turns out, is very, very general, and we can recover many formulations of population genetics and quantitative genetics as special cases. But there is a problem with this formulation. It's entirely deterministic. There is no drift in this formulation. And in fact, if you want to derive this continuous time equation, you need to postulate infinitely large populations. My goal in this talk is essentially to fix this. Unlike selection, which has this very, very general framework laid out by the price equation, stochasticity in evolutionary dynamics doesn't have a single unified framework. The two most common frameworks for modeling stochasticity are from about a century ago. There's one due to Wright and Fisher and one due to Moran. I'm not going to tell you what these models are, but what's important here is that in both the Wright-Fisher and the Moran models, the total population size is held strictly constant, but the composition is subject to stochastic drift. What this means is the following. Let's say we have our red and blue birds as before. And let's say one of these birds gives birth to a blue baby. For the population to move to its next state, we also need to choose some other bird in the population, in this case, this red bird, to die, so that the total number of birds is the same, but the proportion of blue birds has changed. This is somewhat artificial, right? Because in the real world, total populations are not strictly constant. They fluctuate all the time. This was an assumption made for mathematical convenience by Wright-Fisher and Moran, but it's not really biologically justified. A major advance to this framework is due to Motu Kimura, where they studied populations with varying population size, where size changes deterministically according to some external rules, but composition is subject to drift. So, for example, we might know from some rules, like the logistic equation, that one bird must be born in this population, but the identity of this bird, whether it's red or blue, is stochastic and subject to drift. This is somewhat better. And in this case, Kimura showed that in these sort of models where you have deterministic population size change, one can define something called an effective population size that's constant and relate this to Wright-Fisher or Moran models. This is still somewhat artificial though. In the real world, total population size changes sort of naturally as composition changes. They don't change independent of each other. In fact, Hutchinson famously said that the ecological theater is where the evolutionary play unfolds. Or as a more recent paper put it, all paths to fitness lead through demography. So while we may speak about the fitness of red birds in some abstract terms in population genetics models, these fitnesses must ultimately emerge from births and deaths of individual birds. And this is the domain of ecology, it's the domain of demography. So it's desirable to derive evolutionary principles, such as, let's say, the price equation, from these sort of ecological rules of birth and death. And this is what I will do. I won't go through the gory details of the math in this talk, but I will use this slide to briefly outline my approach, and I'll provide some intuitions in further slides. And this is just so that you can look up these words if you want to know technical details, or maybe some of these are already familiar to you. So to start with, one can describe any such closed population that varies stochastically as what's called a Markov chain. And this is described via something called a master equation. Again, these names don't matter too much. It's just so that you can look it up if you want it. Then, using the fact that population dynamics are often density dependent, one can arrive at an approximate continuous description through something called the Fokker-Planck equation, or an SDE. Then, using the fact that we must have per capita birth and death rates, you can derive suitable notions of quantities like fitness, which are evolutionary quantities. And what we want to remember to describe evolution is to describe how trait frequencies change. And you can then derive an equation for how trait frequencies change. Again, because these quantities are stochastic and varying, they're not deterministic, you can't use normal rules of calculus. You need to use some special thing called stochastic calculus. But this is just a mathematical detail. What we want is biological insight. And the big biological insight from carrying through this is that we will find that there is a directional process which affects evolutionary trajectories in finite populations that is neither classical natural selection nor neutral genetic drift. So, whereas for infinitely large populations, we have the price equation, which looks like this in words. There is an effective selection and a mutation bias. I will show that for finite fluctuating populations, the relevant equation instead looks like this, where there are two extra terms. There is one term capturing random undirected fluctuations that are equally likely to move the population in either direction. This is drift. But there's also a new directional term. And this will be of interest, and I'll speak about it later. Because mutation acts the same way in both these finite and infinite populations, it's somewhat distracting. So for the purposes of this talk, I will not speak about mutation too much. I have dealt with it in detail in my thesis, and I can point you to that if you want details later. So let's provide some intuition for what this pipeline actually means. Let's say we have a population of birds, red and blue, and this population is closed. If there are no catastrophic changes like a natural disaster, say, this population can change in exactly 4 ways. Red birds can be born, red birds can die, blue birds can be born, or blue birds can die. That's all that can happen. So to characterize such a system, we need two numbers, one characterizing the population size of each bird at the current time, and 4 functions. 2 functions describing the birth rate and death rate of red birds in this population, and 2 functions characterizing the birth rate and death rate of blue birds in such a population. These rates might be very, very, very complicated. They may incorporate mate choice, they may incorporate pleiotropy, epistasis, all sorts of things. But in principle, they must exist, and that's all I'm going to use. Once we know these functions, we can then describe how a population changes by tracking which states are accessible from which other states. For example, if you have 1 red bird, maybe you have 2 red birds with some probability, and you know this probability because of the birth rates and death rates. This you can describe mathematically through something called a master equation, which I'm not going to show. Our first assumption here is that birth and death rates are density dependent. More precisely, we'll assume that you can find a carrying capacity K, which puts a bound on population growth, such that population growth is expected to be negative if the population is greater than K. Now, K equals infinity, thus corresponds to infinitely large populations. This is a ubiquitous assumption in ecology and usually arises because resources are finite. So the carrying capacity in some systems are going to be habitat size, in some systems it's going to be some limit on nutrition, but often you can find a suitable parameter. If a carrying capacity exists, we can transition from population numbers n to population densities x by dividing by the carrying capacity. What this means for our purposes is that whereas before the population was transitioning in units of 1 individual, it will now transition in units of 1 by k in terms of density. And if k is moderately large, you can exploit this mathematically because changes in xi will look sort of continuous if k is small. Because we're now talking about densities instead of numbers, we need to rescale the birth and death rates. And I will use this little superscript k just to help you remember that we are talking about population densities and not numbers. Now, I will make one more assumption, which is that we can define per capita birth and death rates. This again is so ubiquitous in ecology that often we say birth rate and death rate, even though we mean per capita birth and death rates. And this happens because, well, interactions are usually at the individual level in eco-evolutionary systems. And therefore, these birth rates and death rates must also be defined at individual levels. It should be possible to do this. Mathematically, what this means is that the birth rates and death rates should look like this. I should be able to have population density times some function. This function is the per capita birth rate, and this function is the per capita death rate of type I individuals. Again, this beta and delta might be very, very, very complicated functions. They might incorporate pleiotropy, epistasis, whatever you want. But what we need is that the total birth rate in the population, you should be able to write it this way, as density times something. Now notice that if there are no red individuals in the population, let's say, they might still be born because of mutations of other types. And to incorporate this, you technically need one more term here that incorporates mutations. But like I said, in this talk, I won't discuss this too much other than to say that you can parameterize it via a mutation rate. And that's all I'll say. Now that we have, will turn out to be important. One quantity, which I'll call fitness or Malthusian fitness, is the difference between the per capita birth and death rate. It should be somewhat intuitive that this should behave like Malthusian fitness, because if this is positive, that means your birth rate is more than your death rate per capita, and so you should grow in the population. But because we're talking about continuous time, these are probabilistic rates instead of numbers. So I will also define another quantity, which I'll call turnover, which is the sum of the birth and death rates per capita. It's not immediately evident why this matters at all, but intuitively, what this measures is the total number of events that a type is experiencing. Remember, a birth rate is a measure of how many births this type, let's say a red bird, experiences per unit time. And the per capita death rate is a measure of how many deaths this type experiences per unit time. So together, it's a measure of how many events this type experiences at all. And again, it's not immediately clear why this is important, but I hope to convince you that it is shortly. Remember this example, even though we've been speaking about population density so far, what we want is changes in population frequency. And because here our total population size is allowed to be whatever, it can fluctuate stochastically, we need to be able to talk about frequencies in these sort of varying populations. So we'll develop some language to speak about this. Let's say we have m different types of birds, red, blue, green, and so on. We can first define the scaled total population size by just summing up the number of red birds, the number of blue birds, the number of green birds, and so on. And notice that this can vary stochastically here. It does not have to be a constant, unlike in, let's say, Wright Fisher or Moran models. We can also define the frequency in a very straightforward manner by counting the number of red birds and then dividing by the total number of birds. Let's assume now that we also have some phenotype, F, associated with each type. This could be beak length, it could be some measure of color, it has to be some numerical value. We want this because we want to talk about how mean values of phenotypes change in populations. So we can define the mean value in a straightforward manner by just taking each Fi and weighting it by the proportion of type I individuals in the population. If we have two quantities, F and G, we can also speak about their covariance using the usual definition of covariance. Notice that we're not making any new assumptions here. We're just developing language to speak about traits and phenotypes and things like this that we want for evolution. So what do we get from all this setup? It's been a lot of math setup so far. Well, the first thing that I want to show you is a stochastic generalization of what's called the replicator equation. It turns out that we can derive this with no other assumptions, just the assumption that you have per capita birth and death rates and the assumption that there is a carrying capacity. So again, let's think of m birds, m types of birds, red, blue, green, so on. The standard replicator equation comes from both population genetics and evolutionary game theory, and it looks like this. It says that the frequency of type I, the change is determined according to its fitness relative to the mean fitness of the population. This equation says that if the fitness of a type is greater than the average population fitness, the prevalence of that type in the population increases. This is sort of a quantitative way of saying what we think of as natural selection in a common sense setting. This standard replicator equation is deterministic. It's formulated for infinitely large populations. It's used in game theory. Our version, which you can derive for our stochastic populations, instead looks like this. There are two extra terms now, notice. The first thing I want you to notice about this is that if we let the carrying capacity go to infinity, which remember corresponds to infinitely large populations, these last two terms vanish because they have a 1 by k and a 1 by root k. And you recover the standard replicator equation in the infinite population limit. This is encouraging because it means we're at least doing something right. But for finite populations, these two extra terms exist. The last term, which I have not written out explicitly, describes undirected fluctuations. If you're familiar with some population genetics, you can see that this also exhibits a 1 by root k scaling, which is sort of characteristic of drift. And what undirected means in this context is that it's equally likely to be positive or negative and by the same amount. And if you average over many trials or experiments, this last term does not contribute to the average dynamics. Okay, but there are two terms which do contribute to the average dynamics. The first one, which is in purple, is the same as in the standard replicator equation. It represents natural selection. It says if your fitness is greater than average fitness, you increase in the population. But there's also a new term, and there are exclamation marks to indicate that you should be surprised by this. This new term says that if the turnover of a type is greater than the average population turnover, its prevalence in the population decreases. Notice this minus sign. We call this noise-induced selection because it looks exactly like natural selection with a minus sign, but it's induced entirely by stochasticity. If you move to infinitely large populations, it vanishes. And its strength in finite populations is inversely proportional to the total population size. You can also derive a stochastic generalization of the price equation. So for the price equation, we have m types of birds as before, and we have a phenotype associated with each bird. This phenotype can be any numerical quantity. It could be fitness itself in particular. The standard price equation, again in the absence of mutation, looks like this. I had shown this to you before. It says that the mean fitness changes according to the covariance of the phenotype with fitness. So if you covary positively with fitness, the mean phenotype increases. Our version for finite fluctuating populations looks like this, where again, there are two extra terms. One describing undirected fluctuations that vanishes if you average over many realizations, and one which does not. And this again looks exactly like natural selection, but with a minus sign. If you covary positively with turnover, your prevalence decreases, and the strength of this effect is inversely proportional to the total population size. There are several immediate corollaries that follow from the price equation. I will show you just one. Now, infinite populations obey this price equation. This is just the standard price equation. If you now substitute f equals W, if you let the phenotype be fitness itself, because the phenotype can be anything, remember, then once you notice that the variance of a random variable is just the covariance of the variable with itself, the equation transforms to this. This is called Fisher's fundamental theorem, and it says some interesting things about how evolution operates. So, for example, it says that the mean fitness in the population cannot decrease because variance is always non-negative. And the rate at which the mean fitness changes is proportional to how much variation in fitness is currently in the population. Our finite populations tell a different story. They obey a slightly different equation. There's an additional term. And if you now substitute f equals W, you get a modified version of Fisher's fundamental theorem, which looks like this. This equation says a different story again. Notice that mean fitness in this case can absolutely decrease because this entire sum might be negative. And perhaps even more surprisingly, even if there is no variation in fitness whatsoever, the mean fitness can still systematically change as long as there is variation in either the per capita birth rates or the per capita death rates, and the total population size is finite. So let's recapitulate what we have so far, because I've been throwing a lot of equations at you. We defined a notion of fitness, per capita birth rate minus per capita death rate, and a notion of turnover, which is the sum of the per capita birth and death rates. And then if you have any type level quantity, so I've written approximately phenotype because people don't always agree on whether you should call fitness a phenotype. Then infinite populations obey the standard price equation, which says higher fitness is better. This is natural selection. But finite populations say that higher fitness is better, but also higher turnover is worse. Notice that this is a special case of our more general equation, because if you move to infinite populations, you will recover this. There are some funny consequences of this equation. For example, even if a trait does not covary at all with fitness, something that would be considered neutral, it can still change systematically if it covaries with turnover rate. And I will illustrate this with an example because there's been a lot of math and often people are skeptical of math. So I'll illustrate it with an IBM, an individual based model. Let's consider a model of resource competition where red and blue birds compete with each other. But this competition decreases the birth rate of red birds, but increases the death rate of blue birds. In Lotka-Volterra format, this equation looks like this. So here are the competition terms. This is standard Lotka-Volterra competition. And I've assumed that the competition coefficients are the same for the red and blue birds. They're just in different places, right? So whenever they compete, the red bird experiences a lower birth rate, but the blue bird experiences a higher death rate. Now, if you compute birth rate minus death rate, which is the measure of fitness, these will be the same. And maybe you can even see it here. It is 1, the N1, N2 is the same. There is an N1 here, there is an N1 here. But if you compute the sum, the birth plus death rates, there's a minus sign here. So when there is competition, this competition decreases the turnover rate of the red birds because of this minus sign. But because there is no minus sign here, when you compute birth plus death, it increases the turnover rate of the blue bird. So if you had only fitness, these two birds should be exactly the same. And in fact, the proportion of red birds being 0.5 is the only fixed point for this. But because of noise-induced selection, there is some biasing towards red birds. Remember, lower turnover is better. And if you now run simulations, you will see precisely this. On the top, you are looking at a time series where I've plotted the frequency of red birds on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. On the bottom, you're seeing steady state densities where I've plotted the probability density on the y-axis and frequency on the x-axis. Now you can see that for low values of k, the system spends more time above 0.5 than below, significantly more time. It's mostly above, and there is this biasing. It's not symmetric about 0.5. But as you increase the carrying capacity, you recover what you would expect from just deterministic dynamics. Noise-induced selection has actually been seen in a few isolated contexts before, and I will show you. So let's start with cell cycle dynamics. Now, this study by Wodards and colleagues studied competition between two types of cells. There are non-arresting cells, which are constantly dividing, and arresting cells, which occasionally enter this dormant stage, stage 0. Notice that stage 1 and stage 2 are constantly dying and transitioning, but stage 0 does neither. Now, naively, if you equalize growth rates of non-arresting and arresting cells, you may expect that the dynamics are neutral because this stage isn't doing anything, it's just staying still. But that's not what they find. What they find is that the fixation probability of a non-arresting mutant in an arresting population is less than what you would expect if it was neutral. And if the probability, if you spend more time in this dormant stage, the non-arresting mutant does worse and worse. In our language, remember, higher fitness is good, higher turnover is bad. And if you arrest your cell cycle, you reduce your turnover, you reduce the sum of your birth and death rates because you spend some time doing nothing. So here, even though growth rates are equal, there is a biasing towards the type with lower turnover. And in fact, one can mathematically show that their model just is a special case of this equation. But again, I will not do that here. Let me give you another example from social evolution. Social evolution folk care about demographic stochasticity because altruism typically is unstable in infinitely large populations. But this is the famous prisoner's dilemma, for example. But in finite population, often it persists somehow. And there's a lot of work on this topic. I will present just one. A recent 2019 paper by MacLeod and Day showed the following. I'm going to put up some text on the screen. So if a social action alters the recipient's death rate, altruism is favored and spite is disfavored in finite populations. If it instead alters the birth rate, both altruism and spite can be either favored or disfavored. And the precise outcome depends on the ratio of the turnover rate to the population size. Let's look at this in our language. We had fitness and turnover as a difference in sum between the per capita birth and death rates. Now, let's look at altruism reducing the death rate, okay? Because altruism does good things, it should reduce the death rate. If you reduce the death rate, this term becomes lower, and so fitness increases, which is good, right? Remember this equation. But this term also goes down because you're reducing death rate. So turnover also goes down, and that is also good because higher turnover is bad. So altruism is always favored. If instead the social action alters the birth rate, then let's assume altruism increases the birth rate. Then this term goes up. So you get higher fitness, which is good. But this term also goes up. So you get higher turnover, which is bad. And the precise outcome depends on the ratio of the population turnover rate to the total population size. And again, one can show mathematically that their model is just a special case of ours. In fact, our framework of noise-induced selection conceptually unifies several previous studies in many, many different contexts by showing that there are special cases of a very general phenomenon that occurs whenever you have finite fluctuating populations. On the mathematical end, these go from the contact process to birth death models. On the biology side, they go from life history to epidemiology. And these are all various studies that have been showing that in stochastic populations, you can have strange things happening. And these strange things are just different manifestations of what we have been calling noise-induced selection here. And one can show this mathematically. So I'll wrap up here because I think this has been a lot. And I'll just give you some odds and ends before I wrap up. So you might have noticed that I gave you an equation for how trait frequencies change. This was the replicator equation. I gave you an equation for how mean phenotype changes. This was the price equation. But often we care about more than the mean, especially as empiricists and especially in finite populations. Why stop at the mean value? Variances, for example, can be very important. And you're right, you're absolutely right. In fact, we derive an equation for the variances. It looks a little scarier than the first two equations, but not too much scarier. This equation also says a lot of interesting things, but I won't go into it in detail. But perhaps to give you a flavor, if you look at the first term, f minus f bar squared is a measure of the distance of f from the population mean. Covariance of fitness with this distance from the mean is a measure of what type of selection operates in the system. Is it stabilizing? Is it disruptive or diversifying, and so on? And this is also the same. One can also prove that in the variance equation, the mu dot mutation term is always non-negative, meaning that mutation always increases variance of any trait in the population. This is a rigorous formulation of the idea of mutation as supplying variation. One can also show that this term is always negative. For example, a variance is always non-negative. And mean turnover is birth rate plus death rate. It's the sum of two positive quantities. So this term is always positive. And because it's a minus sign, this term always decreases variance. And you can show that this is the effect of demographic stochasticity, which people say that it decreases variation, it removes trait variation. And this is a rigorous formulation of that effect. In fact, the recipe we provide lets you compute in principle any moment of a type level quantity. You can compute the kurtosis, the skew, whatever you want. But in the real world, it often gets very complicated. You can see that the variance equation already looks more complicated than the mean, which looks more complicated than the frequency. And as you keep going, they get more and more complicated. So it's more tedious to compute, but you can do it if you're really persistent. The other thing you might have noticed is that I've only been speaking about discrete traits. I've been saying red, blue, green, bird, but many traits in the real world are not discrete. For example, if instead of color, we looked at beak length of birds, in many cases, beak length does not vary discretely, it varies quantitatively because it's under the influence of many, many different factors. This is especially true for the kind of complex phenotypes that we deal with in behavioral ecology. where rarely do you find clean-cut discrete traits. So why stop at discrete traits? This is a good question. You don't have to stop at discrete traits. There's a slight complication. While for these sort of discrete traits, you can characterize the system by a vector. You can just count the number of red birds, blue birds, green birds, and so on. This is always a finite dimensional vector. To look at something like beak length, or let's say body height in humans, you can't count them all in a vector because new variations can keep arising. So you need a probability distribution to characterize the population. Thus, whereas before you had a finite dimensional vector that characterizes the population, for quantitative traits, you have a function instead. So the second half of my thesis is much more mathematically technical, but it shows that the same intuition we develop for discrete traits does carry over for these sort of quantitative traits. You can see maybe that these words are a lot scarier. They have things like infinite dimensional and field equations. But again, these are just mathematical technicalities. So this is all mathematically new ground. As far as we know, we have not seen these tools used not just in biology, but we also have not seen them in mathematics or physics. So we do think they are new tools, but biologically, your takeaway is that what we just spoke about, noise-induced selection and turnover rate, also applies for quantitative traits. So it's biologically intuitive. So I'll start wrapping up here. If there is one takeaway I want you to go home with from this talk, it's just this, that higher fitness is good and higher turnover is bad. And we were able to derive this equation because we started from the ecology. We started from birth rates and death rates. If we had taken fitness as God-given, we would not have arrived at this term, because this term is a consequence of how you derive fitness. So there is an evolutionary force, selection for reduced turnover rates, noise-induced selection, that is dependent on ecological birth and death rates, and it's particular to finite fluctuating populations. The fluctuating part, though I did not speak about it in detail, you can show mathematically that if the total population size is a constant, this term vanishes. And so models like, let's say, Wright-Fisher or Moran can't capture these evolutionary dynamics of finite fluctuating populations. This is not a problem if you want to study Wright-Fisher or Moran models. This is also not a problem if you have pretty big models, because this effect becomes very small because of the 1 by k and k. But in small populations, it can cause differences. And notice, turnover rate, the per capita turnover rate, is specified for each phenotype in the population. So you can't magic it away with an effective population size, because each type of individual demands its own effective population size. You can't find an effective population size for the entire population. This fact that when you have fluctuating populations stochastically, you can't have an effective population size, has actually been pointed out since the 70s or maybe even slightly earlier by people like Gillespie. But yeah, we recapitulated too. On a related note, growth rate or fitness is not sufficient to predict the dynamics in finite fluctuating populations, even when there is no mutation, and even on taking many, many trials. So neutral genetic drift, for example, people assume that if you average over many, many, many trials, you can sort of, it just blurs out results, you can remove it. But this is a directional effect. Mind you, fitness can do a pretty good job for large populations because this makes the entire effect size small. But if you have populations which are neutral or near neutral, where this term is close to 0, or if you have small populations where this entire thing becomes small, noise-induced selection can alter your dynamics significantly. On a related note, you should be careful about where you implement ecological effects, on births or on deaths, in experiments or on simulations. So if you saw the red bird, blue bird example, or the social evolution example, it matters where these effects go. In evolutionary game theory, for example, there is a long-standing convention to implement all ecological effects into the birth rate and keep a constant death rate whenever you simulate. This is sort of a convention that's just developed. There's no biological motivation for why things shouldn't affect the death rate. And these results show that where you put these effects matter. So if you want to model a system especially in IBM, where you can get really, really high precision, you should look at the system's biology and decide where to implement the ecological effects instead of making seemingly arbitrary choices, because these seemingly arbitrary choices can affect your dynamics in a way you might not have intended. So I'd like to thank my supervisors, Vishu and Rohini, and the respective labs. This is Vishu lab, this is Rohini lab. I'll thank Sudipto for letting me speak here and the government for paying me. And I'll wrap up here. If you want to read all the gory mathematical details, you can scan this QR, or you can reach out to me on any of these platforms, and I'll be happy to send it to you or speak to you more. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent, Shikhara. I mean, this is very nice with respect to multiple grounds. Thank you. Thanks for this nice talk. So anybody, if anybody has any questions, do raise hands. I'll take them up and we can discuss. So while people are thinking, if I can ask, I'm still wrapping my head around to the intuition of this turnover number. I mean, basically, okay, I mean, a portion of this thing I teach in the evolutionary genetics course. And as obviously, because of that, I'm slightly biased towards thinking in certain way. And one of the way is essentially like considering birth and death to be equivalent. Just that one is adding number, another is subtracting, but effectively it's the number what matters, which remains. Which essentially what you have done, you have smashed that idea. And I'm trying to wrap my head around exactly how this thing got smashed, or rather exactly what does it mean by increasing turnover number. Of course, we understand by increasing birth rate and death rate, but how that is relevant in the context of evolution.
Yeah,
so
this is a
I'm
good question.
More than mathematics, I'm mostly thinking about the intuition, exactly how we intuit it. Yeah.
So this is a good question. I'll premise by saying our intuition for this is not 100% there yet. We are trying to understand this biologically, but we have some ideas. So so first thing, we found this mathematically, and then we simulated it in IBMs and found that it seems to work. And it recapitulates a lot of previous studies, which means it's a real effect.
Correct. And no, that much is and basically evidence-wise, I'm totally convinced, but I'm just trying to figure out the connect dots.
So here's our best guess currently. If you write down what the equations for how these change, it turns out that if you look at densities instead of frequencies, the fitness, which is birth minus death, controls this deterministic aspect, which controls the mean, but the turnover rate controls the variance. So here I've plotted two populations, one in red, one in blue, which have the same mean, same birth minus death, but the blue has a 10-fold difference in birth plus death. Okay. And what is happening is that the blue one fluctuates a lot more, even though they fluctuate about the same value. And the problem with this, if you are a population, is that if you go down, there are two problems. One, if you go extinct, there is no coming back. And if you fluctuate more, you are more likely to just stochastically go extinct. The other problem is that these are per capita rates. So the total rate of change is your per capita rate times your current density. This means that if your population rate becomes very low, let's say you have high variance and your population number becomes low, you experience less change because it is your growth rate times your current density. So you stay low for longer. So this blue guy, for example, if your population size is 100, it experiences a fitness times 100 as its total growth rate. But if you are at 200, where your fitness is negative because you're above carrying capacity, you experience 200 times fitness, which is more. So whenever you go up, you get pushed down because you experience more change. But whenever you have low population numbers, you experience less change in total because it's multiplicative.
I see. Okay. Yeah, no, this is interesting. I mean, this is definitely, I mean, beautiful in multiple aspects.
Yeah.
But
so here's example number 2. Let's say I have 2 people who play a game where they toss coins. Okay. If the coin lands heads, I gain 1 rupee. If the coin lands tails, I lose 1 rupee. Now let's imagine someone who plays every day in red and someone who only plays once in 10 days in blue. What ends up happening to the red person's money is that it fluctuates a lot more. And every so often it'll go very low because they're playing more, even though the expected value is 0. You're expected to just stay at 500. If you gamble more, you lose more. And if you go down, you change less. So you just stay there.
Right. Interesting. It's very interesting. I mean, basically, want to think about it slightly more. And no, this is definitely, it's very nice that you spoke about it. All right. No, that's great. Any other questions, anybody? Or any other comments or anything? Any portion want to revisit? Okay. Great. All right. Yeah. So in that case, if there is nothing, I will stop recording and let us thank Shikhara for this nice talk and particularly for inducing this particular thoughts of effect of noise in finite populations. And really, I mean, basically, I'll probably take up some of these portions and use it for my classes. If not the main lectures, maybe for assignments. All right. Okay. And also thanks to all of you for taking part in this super group meeting. Thanks, and hoping to see you in the next iteration of these talks.
Thank you for having me.